Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we're going to talk about the Grand Salvage. In our previous videos, we talked about the surrender of the German High Seas Fleet at the end of World War I and its subsequent scuttling in the Scottish island chain of the Orkney Islands in Scapa Flow, which was the Royal Navy's wartime fleet base. These videos have been sponsored by established titles. We'll talk more about them later on in the video, but they allow you to become a Scottish lord or lady. So go back and check out our previous videos to see how we got here. But in 1919, Scapa Flow had the most sunken battleships in it of anywhere in the world. Scotland had previously held the record for most battleships in one place, and in 1919 it holds the record for the most battleship wrecks. Originally, people are content to leave them there. The ones that sink in shallow water are salvaged by either the Royal Navy to be divided up among the victorious powers, or are salvaged by locals living in the Orkney Islands who go on and strip whatever they can. Many of the ships are partially submerged and relatively inaccessible, or submerged in shallow water, and a few are submerged in deep water. Again, initially, they're just left in place. In the immediate post-war years, there were tons of vessels being decommissioned, and so there was a lot of opportunity for scrapping these ships that were being taken out of service, especially as you go into 1922, and the Washington Naval Treaty limits the number of battleships that a country can have. So many of the early first and second generation dreadnoughts are being scrapped at this time. But when that process is completed, now suddenly there is a hole in the market that was being filled by these warships. Warships, like Battleship New Jersey, are built with tens of thousands of tons of really high-grade armor steel or other precious non-ferrous metals like the bronze of this big steam pump here in the engine room. So a battleship like this could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in scrap money in 1920s money. So despite not operating any battleships themselves, Scotland has a rich history involving battleships, and you can be a part of that history now thanks to this video's sponsor, Established Titles. Established Titles allows you to buy as little as 1 square foot of land on a Scottish estate, and because of the ancient Scottish tradition where landowners in Scotland are lords or ladies, you too could become a lord or a lady, which means that you could officially put that on things like plane tickets, credit cards, even your dating profiles. While I like being called a lord, my favorite thing about this is every time you buy a plot through Established Titles, they give some of that money to charities like One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future, which both plant trees, which is very important because the reason why a lot of trees got cut down was for the Navy, building the old wooden ships of the line. So places like Scotland and other places around the world got largely deforested because of this. So we're finally working on replacing that, and I love that our partners, Established Titles, are doing that. Check out the link in the description below. The first 200 of you who click it will get a plot near my plot, so we can have our own little kingdom there in Scotland.
Your certificate features a unique plot number with which you can see the exact location of your land.
And right now there is a sale going on where if you use our code establishedtitles.com/battleship, you get a 10% discount off any purchases. So don't miss your opportunity to become a Scottish lord or lady in the land that once had the most battleships sunk in it. I say once because, like I was saying earlier, as the already existing battleships are scrapped, the Washington Naval Treaty is also preventing new battleships from being built. So normally you would be building new battleships every year and then getting rid of older battleships. Well, here we're getting rid of all of them at one time, and then by the mid-1920s, all of the battleships that are left are being retained because the Washington Naval Treaty says that you can. So there aren't any major scrapping efforts going on. So this entrepreneur named Ernest Cox has been making a lot of money scrapping decommissioned battleships. And now that market has dried up, but there is still a need for this high quality steel as you're in the middle of the roaring 20s. And there's a lot of industry going on here in the post-war years. So he gets the bright idea to go to the Admiralty and buy the salvage rights for some of the German ships. Most of the German destroyers, or torpedo boats as they were often called, were actually moored in relatively shallow water. And they're pretty light ships, less than 1,000 tons each, so in theory, easily accessible. Now, Cox had no experience with marine salvage, but some experience with scrapping, and looking at the price of scrap metal those days, he thought it would be a very lucrative thing to do this. And he had bought an old captured German floating dry dock to help with the scrapping process earlier, so it was relatively easy for him to tow that to Scapa Flow, hire some professionals who knew what they were doing, and then bring in a lot of locals to help out with this. And so he spent something like 250 pounds in like 1926 dollars to buy 26 of the German destroyers and 2 of the German battle cruisers that were moored in relatively shallow water. So he immediately starts with the destroyers and was having pretty good success with them. The tidal shift in Scapa Flow is pretty severe, so they were able at low tide to access parts of the hulls of many of these ships, and so they could do a lot of work. And he figures out that these ships are not battle damaged. It's not like the salvage efforts after the attack on Toronto or the attack on Pearl Harbor, where you've got big jagged holes blown in your ships. Basically, the German crews left doors open, and they opened up the sea chests in the bottom of the ship to allow water in. So all you had to do was plug those sea chests, close doors, and then you could start pumping air into these ships, and they were still perfectly watertight. And many of these ships had rolled over as part of their sinking. That's not at all uncommon, especially for ships like battleships that have a lot of top weight with really tall superstructures to see over the horizon where the guns are going to be firing. So very common for ships to sink like that. We as Americans are pretty used to looking at, say, the footage from Pearl Harbor where these ships sink straight down in shallow water, and that is not at all the norm when a battleship goes down. So most of these ships are sitting upright at low tide. You can get pretty close to the hulls, so it's real easy to close all the sea chests, all the openings in the bottom of the ship, and then your ship is practically watertight. You can just start pumping air in, and they would send divers in to these compartments, and fortunately it had only been a couple of years since these ships sank, so there was a lot of marine growth, but it wasn't so heavily overgrown and infested that they couldn't navigate the interiors of these ships, so they could go in and close doors and start filling individual compartments with air. And through this and through cutting off the superstructures of many of these ships, which could be more easily salvaged later off of the seabed, they lightened the ship enough that they could raise it. And then they figured out the Italians had lost a battleship during the war called Leonardo da Vinci in port. And right around the same time frame, the Italians pioneered a method of raising the ship and putting it in dry dock while it was still capsized. Now, unfortunately, after all the expense of raising Da Vinci, they decided that they didn't have the money to restore the ship, so she ends up getting scrapped anyway. But Cox is a smart guy, and he reaches out to all sorts of people, and he learns about this technique of you can just put a capsized ship in dry dock. You're not trying to save the vessel. Like, who cares if it gets damaged going in on its deck instead of on its hull like it's supposed to? You're basically just towing it to a scrapper to be cut up. So he's able to do this, and he raises, after he's gotten his practice with the destroyers, then he starts to do the bigger ships. It's not easy. It's not easy. No two salvages are the same. The ships are sunk in all sorts of different positions. There's all sorts of problems with them. In some instances, large sections of the interior of the ship are not safely accessible, so he has to affix pontoons to help make the thing buoyant to get it back to the surface. He manages to raise the destroyers in an average of 4 to 6 weeks, although one is so accessible he's able to raise it in just 4 days. The battleships and battle cruisers, being significantly larger but also significantly more valuable, cause some more issues. In some instances, ships that he has raised sink again, and they have to re-raise them. In one instance with the battlecruiser Vonderton, the compartment has some combustible gas in it, so when the guys are inside trying to cut through a bulkhead with a torch, it causes an explosion that hurts some people, and then the compartment starts to flood and they have to get down there. They are able to save people there, but on other salvage missions, people are killed. There is a coal strike in 1926 that threatens to shut operations down entirely because all of the air compressors and the other powered machinery is coal-fired. Well, Cox is no man's fool. He realizes that these German ships are full of coal. So he's able to use the coal that he has salvaged from the ships he's raised to continue to power his equipment and keep working on these ships, even while the coal strike is going on. In fact, many historians credit Cox and his shipwrecking efforts in Scapa Flow with reducing the severity of the depression in the Orkney Islands, because he's employing so many of these guys and he keeps them working through the depression. And at the end of the day, the price of scrap metal goes down, and he never quite breaks even with this part of his business. But as an entrepreneur, he owns a number of other businesses, and he is able to retire quite wealthy. And the Royal Navy, throughout the interwar and World War II era, reach out to him whenever they have to do salvage. He goes into this with no experience, but by the end of it, he is the most experienced person at raising these shipwrecks in Great Britain. So he gets a number of jobs doing that when ships sink. This is probably a good time to talk about how scrapping ships is nowhere near as lucrative as many people think it is. And we previously did a video on why the Navy sold Kennedy and Kitty Hawk for just $1 a piece, and how those scrappers probably are not going to break even though they've got 60 or 70 or 80,000 tons of really high-grade metals that they're going to be selling off. There are so many challenges associated with this, and so many costs associated with cutting these up, and so many hazardous materials there. Why even bother? These ships were hazards to navigations in the channels. People were catching their fishing nets on them, so it was ruining people's livelihoods. After the war, German industry is absolutely wrecked. So during World War I, Krupp steel was probably the best steel in the world. And so there's still a desire for that in the post-war world. Where do you get it? These sunken wrecks have tens of thousands of tons of it on it each. So there was value in doing this. It's just, at the end of the day, so many of these were scrapped that the price ends up going down from what it was at the high after World War I when all of those vessels were initially scrapped. So, did Cox and the successor companies that buy the rights to these ships after him get all the wrecks from Scapa Flow? No, some of them were too deep down or too difficult and ended up not being saved. So there's still a couple of ships there. These are the only extant Imperial German battleships anywhere in the world. In 2001, the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Area Act was applied to these wrecks to protect the surviving ones so they could no longer be salvaged. However, as recently as 2019, some of the wrecks were sold. This is really cool. I, of course, have my own battleship, but there's only 8 of these open as museums. How do you get your own battleship? Well, these wrecks are pretty much the only ones that come up for sale because most of the other ones are protected as war graves. These didn't have guys die on them or be interred on them, so they are not graves. So you could buy one of these shipwrecks. In 2019, the battleships Markgraf, Koenig, and Crown Prince Wilhelm were each sold for £25,500, 2019 dollars, and the light cruiser Karlsruhe was sold for £8,500. Now that is an absolute bargain. Because of the Archaeological Act, they can't scrap these ships anymore, but they own them. Which, at the end of the day, who doesn't want to own a German battleship? And also, who doesn't want to be a Scottish Lord? Remember, this is your chance to become a Scottish Lord through established titles. Check out the link in the description below. And remember to use the code BATTLESHIP for a special discount. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. We really appreciate the support of companies like Established Titles. You can also support the museum by liking, sharing, and subscribing so that more people find out about us in the channel. Thanks for watching.